My presentation for the evening is on creation and cavemen, and I initially programmed this thinking that I would give my standard lecture on human fossils and origins and that sort of thing. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought there's more to talk about than just that. So if you're watching this on your computer or YouTube or whatever, you're thinking, have I seen this before? You haven't seen this before. This is new, definitely. So let's dig right in here. So when we read in the scripture, we not only read about Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and the events that are described in Genesis 3, but we also read in the New Testament some pretty detailed and emphatic statements on the part of the Apostle Paul in Romans 5, 1 Corinthians 15, that links the sin of Adam to the redemption of Jesus Christ. So here's Romans 5:19, "For as by one man's disobedience the many were made sinners, so by the one man's obedience the many will be made righteous." There's lots of other passages as he goes through and develops this idea of Jesus Christ as the last Adam. So as we think about human origins and we think about this evidence for human evolution, it's not as simple as just saying, well, maybe Adam is not really a historical individual. You start tugging at that thread and really big things come along with it right away, right? The way I like to think about Christian theology, I don't like to think about it as simply, this idea is foundational to that idea over there. I like to think of it as a big tapestry, and you start pulling on some threads, and they're fine. They're just loose threads. They come off. It's not a big deal. You misunderstood something in the Bible, and it's not a problem. And that's why we have all these denominations, right? Because if we could all read the Bible perfectly and know what it meant, there wouldn't be all these denominations. We wouldn't have these disagreements. But there are other threads, I think, that when you start pulling on them, the whole thing just starts to unravel, and it's a mess. And I think Adam is probably one of those things. If you start tugging on the reality of Adam and his fall, then the tapestry starts to fall apart. So Adam is an important thing. The creation of Adam is an important thing. Now, the question for my lecture here is, what do fossils say about Adam and Eve? And the simple answer is nothing, because they're dead. Or we might ask a more thoughtful question, and that is, how do we answer the question at hand? And that's what really started me thinking about this whole issue, because I started to think, well, how do I even know what to say about fossils and hominins and all that other stuff that goes with it? Because so much of that is going to be wrapped up in the way we think about humanity, the way we think about fossils, the way we think about everything. So, to explore this idea, I thought we should go back to some deep history here. Not quite deep, but 500 years. You think about church history and the origin of humanity, there really wasn't any doubt about Adam and Eve being the original progenitors of mankind until about the 1600s. And it was during that age of exploration that people started to raise questions and to suggest that perhaps there's something weird going on here that we don't quite understand. So obviously the culture shock of discovering what we Europeans think of as the New World, wasn't new to the people living here, but the New World, the North and South American continents, that was a big deal. And that was a big deal for all of those Christians who were exploring these new continents and encountering these Native American peoples. And roughly the same time, we had the advent of African slavery, which dramatically altered European opinions about races and African individuals, to be quite specific. So an example of this we can see here in José de Acosta. Acosta was a Jesuit Spaniard missionary, and he lived 17, 18 years in Central and South America. And he wrote a book called Natural and Moral History of the Indies. And unlike most of his Spanish brethren at the time, he had a pretty decent opinion about the Native Americans. He didn't think they were stupid. He didn't think they were to be exploited. He actually worked and talked with many of them and learned a lot about them. His book is fascinating. His book is available in an English translation. So if you ever get a chance to read it, it's fascinating. And it's full of passages just like this. Because on the one hand, we know for certain that there have been men in these parts for many centuries. And on the other hand, we cannot deny what Holy Writ clearly teaches, that all men were preceded by a first man. We will undoubtedly be forced to admit that men crossed to these parts from Europe or Asia or Africa. But how and by what route they came, we must still ask and seek to know. For I ask myself, with what motive, with what means, with what strength could the men of the Indies have crossed such an immense sea? Truly, I have debated this point with myself and others many times, and have never found an answer that satisfies me. So Acosta here is wrestling with this, what he believes to be the historical record of Noah's Ark, right? And Noah's Ark landed on Ararat, which is sort of an intersection of the three continents that he was aware of, Asia, Europe, and Africa. And then they discover this whole new set of continents with all these people living there already, and how did they get there? Acosta wonders. And why are they different from us? And where did these languages come from? And so forth. He's got material like this all through the book as he is taking his understanding of Scripture, which in many cases, his understanding of Genesis resembles my own, and he is trying to sort of work through what he is observing around him as a scholar and a scientist. In the 1600s, then, we have the first arguments that came out that basically said all humanity did not come from Adam and Eve. And that led to a gigantic argument and debate, and people really fought over this notion of how much diversity can there really be in the human family tree. And there were those who said there's way too much diversity, we can't explain it. And then there were those who said, no, we absolutely can explain it, and all humanity must be descended from Adam and Eve. In the 19th century, we get the same story. So this is Winchell here, born in New York. He became a geologist. In 1854, he was a professor at the University of Michigan. And in 1863, he became a cotton plantation leaseholder, which was a means that was supposed to provide income for former slaves. The former slaves would work the plantation, and Winchell was in charge of one of these plantations, and he was supposed to pay them some sort of fair wage for their work, which amounted to about $5 a month, if you were lucky. So obviously that didn't work very well. But through that experience, he became acquainted with the former slaves, and of course, being a 19th century scholar, he was frighteningly racist by modern standards. 1875, he became professor at Vanderbilt and wrote this book on pre-Adamites. So this is that book that I'm referring to here. If you'd like some chilling and horrifying glimpses into 19th century racist anthropology mixed with biblical interpretation, this is it. This is troubling. And his interpretation here comes in the form of this map. It's a little hard to see. Down here we have his understanding of where the first people came from. He puts their origin there in the Indian Ocean. He doesn't really want to commit to a particular location. He has pre-Africans going into Africa. And they go first. And then we have a pre-Australian branch. And then from the pre-Australians come the pre-Asiatic, who then go into Asia. And along this branch right here, he has the word written Adamites. And then that's followed by Noachites. And then Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So Winchell's solution to the anthropology question and how do we explain all this diversity, Winchell's solution is that there was a primordial origin of all people, and then later God created Adam and Eve as white people, and that white people are the appropriate descendants of Adam and Eve. And if you're not white, then you must be descendant from some previous creation. And you can imagine the 19th century attitudes towards Africans would be, they're basically ignorant and have a propensity to slavery, as if they chose it themselves. It is troubling and horrifying. But what draws me to think about these things most is the reality of how much our understanding of Adam and Eve and origins is so incredibly biased and influenced by our cultural attitudes and by the things that we think are true before we even look at the data, right? So before we even go out there and start looking at human diversity, we've already got a lot of ideas and baggage in our brains telling us that this is what it is and this is what's true. And we're also biased by what we think the data actually are. And this is perhaps the most surprising to people. Winchell, for example, writes in his book that the differences existing between the races are patent to all observation. So people had done measurements on skull shape and size, people had done measurements on brain density and volume, and they had come up with these measurements that showed significant difference between Africans and Europeans. And of course, guess who's always the best, right? The Europeans. We always have the biggest brains, we always have whatever it is that they perceive to be the most advanced, Europeans have it, and everybody else doesn't. So what we now know about science, of course, is that the ratio, what we think of as races, don't really have a lot of biological reality. People groups, ethnicity is far more localized, but it's also far more homogenized. Most individuals alive in the modern world have lots of DNA all mixed together. There's been so much mixing in the modern era since travel became convenient. And so what we think of as ethnic identities are slowly breaking down. There's still a lot of cultural identity, but biologically it can be difficult to recognize what used to be thought of as a race. The way it was lumped together just doesn't have biological reality. And we find from the fossil record, this was the big shocker, that our understanding of human diversity from living people is nothing. It barely even scratches the surface of what we see in the fossil record. And that's what you've come to hear about. So let's continue. But first, beware. Beware of bias, as I already mentioned. And the bias that's most troubling is dehumanization. The psychological attitude and propensity and habit of thinking of people that look like us are the humans, and the ones who don't, they're really different. There's been lots of psychological studies on this. I got into this when I was describing some of my research to an anthropology professor who casually just said, oh yeah, that's dehumanization. What people are doing to the fossils is dehumanization. And she described to me all this horrifying research, and I thought, is that right? So apparently you can study it by just asking people, showing people pictures of people and asking them simple questions like, is this person happy? Is this person sad? Asking them basically to relate to the person on some sort of empathetic level. And you'll find out that, number one, people tend to see other people who are visually different as they don't relate to them as easily as they do people who already look like them. What's weirder, though, is if you tell them, if they look like them, but you tell them that they're from a different region, for example, Yankees versus Southerners, the Yankees will look down on the Southerners, and the Southerners will look down on the Yankees. So it's not just gentle ribbing that we give each other. It's this ingrained thing where people who are not from around here are not human like we are. They're different. So we must be careful that we don't just look at these things that we're going to talk about and say that is or isn't human because it doesn't look like me. Maybe that's true, maybe it's not. We also need to be aware of ignorance because we jump to conclusions readily, and unfortunately it's often based on bias. And that's one of the things that I really want to focus on here, and that is the surprises that God's creation has for us. And God's creation is full of surprises, as we'll talk about here momentarily. All right, so 1856, workers in a cave in the Neander Valley in Germany uncovered this fragmented skull. And as you might guess, Neander Valley gives us the name Neanderthal. And this is the classic original Neanderthal skull. And it is startling in its differences. At the time, the man who described it, though, described it like this. The conclusions at which I arrived were, first, that the extraordinary form of the skull was due to a natural conformation hitherto not known to exist, even in the most barbarous races. Second, that these remarkable human remains belonged to a period antecedent to the time of the Celts and Germans, and were in all probability derived from one of the wild races of northwestern Europe, spoken of by Latin writers. So a couple things to note here. He understands what he's discovered as human. So 1856, this is 1857, 1858 when he's publishing this research. This is prior to Darwin's Origin of Species. This is just a year or two prior to Darwin's origin. So people don't know about evolution yet. And so finding this skull, he's got no reason to think it's anything other than human, because it looks human. There were other bones there with it that were very, very clearly similar to humanity. So there was no reason for him to think anything else. So going back to that issue of bias, right? When you have ideas in your head, they influence how you understand the data. 1891 comes along. Very similar skull cap was found in Indonesia on the island of Java. This is the famous Java man. It was also a thigh bone and this molar tooth. The discoverer of these bones, the discoverer was named Dewar, and he had gone to the jungles of Indonesia specifically and intentionally to look for evidence of the evolutionary transition between humans and apes. So this wasn't just workers randomly digging in a cave and finding something cool. This was a guy who went there with every intention of discovering this kind of evidence. And the fossils, he called them Pithecanthropus. Pithecanthropus means ape man. So again, we have certain levels of expectation going into his interpretation. And then afterwards, he actively and regularly promoted these fossils as the evolutionary transition between ape and man, because they're Pithecanthropus, right? Ape man. Now, what followed then were a string of discoveries in the 20th century, and I've got some here. First of all, I've got a nice model of a modern Homo sapien skull to help us understand what we're going to see here with these guys. You can notice some things. First of all, very tall forehead. We all have extremely tall foreheads. This particular feature here on the mandible, that's called the chin. The chin is basically this forward sweeping protuberance of bone at the bottom of your mandible. So if you just run your finger down, you will notice that bone sort of sweeps out at the bottom. That is a distinctive feature of modern human beings. If we turn it over, you see that behind the eyes here, there's very little of anything. It's just a big round brain case right behind the eyes. And if we look on the bottom, this is called the big hole, Latin foramen magnum, which literally translates to big hole. It's the opening through which the spinal cord passes from the brain to the rest of the body. And the big hole is situated in such a way so that the head is seated right on top of the spinal column, right? So your backbone is capped by the head, and the head sits right on top of the spinal column so that you can look around where you're going. Chimpanzees, gorillas, orangutans, things like that walk around more on all fours rather than just on two legs, their foramen magnum is swept farther back. It's situated back here so that because they have a sort of an angled backbone, they still need to look where they're going, so their foramen magnum is back farther. So this is one of those clues we can use on these skulls to figure out, is this thing walking around on two legs or not? All right, so skulls. First of all, we have La Chapelle, found in 1908. Was also found with a good portion of the rest of the skeleton so that we can hypothetically reconstruct how this guy might have looked when he was alive, what he looked like from the neck down. You'll notice here on La Chapelle, basically all of his molar teeth are gone, and the bone has healed over the sockets where the molars were, so this person lost most of his molars while he was still alive. Let's see here, 1921, we had our first African discovery. This is called Cobway, or Broken Hill. I can get him off there. There he goes. This is Cobway. Similar structure here. There's a very heavy brow ridge there. The forehead, compared to ours, is basically non-existent. It just slopes right back, just like on La Chapelle here. And if we look behind the eyes, the eye sockets stick out pretty far. There is what we call the postorbital constriction, this part of the brain case that is pinched just behind the eyes. And this was the first, this is the first African hominin fossil. And then down here on the end, we have Steinheim, which is found in Germany, northeastern Germany in 1933. Obviously, the skull has been a bit deformed after death, but we can still see very similar, heavy brow ridge, very little forehead. The head slopes right back. So an important feature of the mandible here of La Chapelle is the lack of chin. This guy had no chin at all. The bone here just sweeps straight back, which is very much like you would find in a modern ape and not in a modern human. On the other hand, La Chapelle is nice and complete, and we can see The foramen magnum is right there on the bottom, right where it should be if he were walking around on two legs. The other thing about this guy is the face, the mid-face right here, the nose area, sticks way out farther than it would in a modern human being. So he is definitely different. So differences. Lots of differences. With La Chapelle, there's a lot of similarity below the neck, but with the head, it's really different. And there is no ethnic group today that manifests these sorts of characteristics. This is not something where you can go and say, there's this tribe somewhere in Brazil or something that has these features. No, these are all unique to fossil human beings. The cobway skull here, there's discussion about what it might be. It's from Africa, which isn't really classic Neanderthal territory, but it sure looks like other things called Heidelbergensis. And recently, a specimen of Heidelbergensis had its genome sequenced, and it turned out to be mostly Neanderthal. So these are probably Neanderthal-ish things here, whatever they are. So I'm just going to sort of lump them all together. All three of these guys are your basic Neanderthal, with this one being something perhaps earlier than Neanderthal. All right, so what does it mean then? So with the discovery of La Chapelle, we had the opportunity then to put together a reconstruction of what Neanderthals might have looked like. And can you guess what that reconstruction might look like? Well, if you guess something like that, you'd be exactly right. This is the very first artistic understanding of what Neanderthal looked like. There's nobody alive now who understands things this way. Neanderthals, we've sequenced multiple Neanderthal genomes. We know they are largely pale skin, probably red hair, pale hair color. They were not anything like these gorilla creatures here. And I've never heard anyone mention anything about body hair in Neanderthals. That is unique to this drawing. Now, creationists get very excited about this and talk about bias and reconstructions and that sort of thing. And honestly, this is a reasonable critique, right? So these guys had in their heads this image of what Neanderthals must be like. And this artist here drew them in that way, making them look more like a gorilla than like a human being. 1934 then, Louis Leakey, who would go on to become very famous for his work excavating hominid fossils in Africa, the entire Leakey family up till today, still there, still digging, published an evolutionary tree that looks something like this, with this branch, this trunk here being, basic fossil primates, with a branch that leads to living apes, and then a branch down here that goes off to modern humans and Neanderthals and Java man, the Pithecanthropus fossils. And even though the details of this tree that I didn't reproduce here, there's a lot of timeline stuff and all that other sort of thing that's included in the original diagram. A lot of that detail is not accepted anymore, but it's surprising to me how much this is similar to modern understandings of human evolution. The idea that Neanderthals are our cousins. Java man would actually branch off down here closer to the base before the branching of Neanderthals and modern humans. But there's definitely a divergence before they diverge after the divergence that led to the living apes. So this actually turns out to be surprisingly similar to even our modern evolutionary understanding of Neanderthals. Now, creationists on Neanderthals, I wanted to get a diversity of opinion of creationists, but no, everyone that I consulted, they all agreed Neanderthals are human. So George McCready Price here in 1924, specimens such as that of Neanderthal were evidently the degenerate offshoots of this more favored race, what he calls the noble ancients. And they may very likely have all lived more or less contemporaneously. So he believed Neanderthals were human and branches of Adam and Eve's original family. Douglas Dewar In 1957, Neanderthal man was the predominant race of man in Europe during the latter part of the Pleistocene period. Most of the fossils of men discovered were provided by him. Therefore, it was thought that he was the earliest and most primitive of all types of mankind. Moreover, his ape-like features were grossly exaggerated by some of Darwin's followers. Well, that's certainly true. But again, Dewar here understands these fossils to be human. 1966, Frank Cousins, Homo neanderthalensis, Neanderthals would, in my view, be grouped with Homo sapiens, that is, modern humans. The choice is largely a matter of personal prejudice and not of anything objective and rigorous. So he downplays the differences between Neanderthals, modern people, and says they're all human. And in 1972, the very first edition of Evolution, the Fossils Say No by Duane Gish, it is now known that Neanderthal man was fully erect and in most details was indistinguishable from modern man, his cranial capacity even exceeding that of modern man. Today, he is classified Homo sapiens, fully human. So, what do the fossils tell us about Adam and Eve? They tell us Adam and Eve had some other kids that were really different than the rest of us, and somehow those other kids died out. Seems simple, right? Well, then along came more discoveries. So the past, I'd say, 10 to 20 years have been just a gold mine of discovery after discovery of fossil hominins. And what we found is that even this neat little picture here of Neanderthals being human turned out to be really simple, because Neanderthals actually are very, 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 very much similar to human beings. There are other things out there that sort of look like human beings that are really, really different. So the two things that I wanted to show you and mention, first one comes from ongoing excavations at a location in the Republic of Georgia, east of the Black Sea, sort of nestled in there with Turkey, Armenia, that area. That's Georgia. That's the Republic of Georgia. This particular site, Dmanisi, has yielded at least 5 hominin crania, which are pretty impressive stuff. This is what they call Skull 5. This is the most recent of the discoveries. And you notice here, this thing is real different from this guy. I mean, strikingly and shockingly different. They really don't look much of anything alike. He has an extremely large jaw. He has no chin. The muzzle sticks way out. His brow ridge is gigantic. His brain case is very small. That post-orbital constriction is extremely pronounced. And yet, there's that foramen magnum right on the bottom of the skull so that he can walk around on 2 legs. This guy has sort of left even conventional anthropologists disagreeing over exactly what it is. The other 4 skulls that have come from Dmanisi, and I love this story, 2 of them are sort of classic Neanderthal shapes. 2 of them are sort of classic Java man shapes. And then there's this guy, who doesn't look like really anything exactly like anything that we've seen before. He's extremely different. What makes this, I think, one of the most interesting stories that we have, so we have things that creationists would say unquestionably are human, the Neanderthal-type skulls, and yet all of these skulls came from this pit, right here. A single, narrow little location. And there they all are. So the scientists excavating them, they're saying, well, it seems odd that one small location would have multiple species of these creatures living in the area. So if this guy is not the same species as the other skulls that they took out, then if he is a different species, that would be strange because he's living all in this one tiny little area here to be buried in the same location. Other anthropologists have said, no, this guy is way too different from anything that we know about. There's no way this thing could be the same species as those other skulls. So among creationists, there is now divided opinion. Some people say, well, I say it's human. And most of the other creationists would argue that it's not human. They would disagree with me. They would say it's too different. It's not really human. I find it really interesting that the highest diversity of hominin skulls that we know about come from the region, the deposit of hominin skulls that's closest to Ararat. That strikes me as really curious. Because if I think that these guys are all descendants of Noah, then it would make sense that the closer you get to their actual origin, the more diverse they would become, right? Because the diversity is being generated from basically a single family, a single little population. So it makes sense to me that this would happen, that there would be high diversity, and even forms that don't look like anything else that we have from Africa or Asia. The other big discovery that's caused even more division is this fellow. This tiny little guy here is called Homo naledi. He was initially discovered in 2013, I believe, and he was published in 2015. First thing you obviously notice is it's quite small. It is, however, an adult skull. We can tell that because of the wear on the teeth. So that is how you know dental development is usually how you can age a skull. It does have a bit of a muzzle. It definitely has that heavy brow ridge, just like a Neanderthal here. It has that postorbital constriction behind the eyes, where the brain is pinched off. These guys were on average 4 feet tall, and their adult brain size would be considerably smaller than the adult brain size of people today. But again, on the bottom here we have that foramen magnum, which is right where it ought to be if it is walking around on 2 legs. The big thing that sort of convinced me was not just my own study of the skulls, but the thing that I found most striking is these guys are found in a highly concentrated cave deposit. So, and I call it a deposit. It's not really a deposit. It's basically sludge at the bottom of a cave that is full of these bones. Hundreds and hundreds, thousands of bones that are all this thing right here. There were a couple of bird bones from some bird that apparently got lost in there, and some rodent teeth, but otherwise nothing down in that cave except these. The place they were discovered was extremely inaccessible, an extremely small opening that you had to go through in order to get into that part of the cave where they were found. And the concentration of remains and the fact that most of the remains seem to be juveniles and late-stage adults, elderly people, led the discoverers to suggest that this is probably a burial ground. That these individuals were dragging the bodies of their kin, their family members, deep underground and leaving them there in some sort of regular, habitual body deposition ritual, whatever you want to call it. I know a cemetery when I see it, though. And I know why people bury the dead, right? That's human. That's a human behavior. But discoverers of this guy, Homo naledi, are very quick to say, this is not human, this is not human, this is very different from human. It is very different from Homo sapiens human, but I'm not so sure that it's not human. The thing that has caused the diversity of opinion, not just the shape and the attributes of the skull, but because we have so many bones from the skeleton, we can look and see what these guys looked like below the neck. And because they're so well preserved, the bones are so well preserved, we have some of the most complete fossils, hominin fossils, that are anywhere in the fossil record. So it is simultaneously the richest deposit and the most complete remains. So what I have right here is a hand, a single hand fossil that represents all the bones of the hand except one. One tiny little wrist bone is missing. But otherwise, it is complete, and it was the hand of one individual. So that's how well this stuff is preserved. An entire person's hand was all together articulated in the mud. And when they excavated it, they just pulled up the bones, and you could just tell what they were. You didn't have to do any comparisons. What was surprising about them is that they are highly curved. So I have a Homo sapien hand model here. If you want to look at it later, we can do that. But these bones are highly curved. This is the kind of feature that you would find in something that climbs regularly. And all of these finger bones are like that. This looks like someone who would do a lot of climbing. The ribs that have been discovered seem to indicate that the higher you go in the rib cage, the more narrow it gets. So the rib cage is shaped like a pyramid. The shoulder blades, our shoulder blades basically have the arms attaching like this. Their shoulder blades have the arms attaching like this. So they would, if they put their hands down to their side, they would sort of look like this. They would be very accustomed to holding their arms above their heads as if they were climbing. So feature after feature of these guys seem to indicate they're climbers. And their skeletons below the neck look really different from ours. And that's what causes a lot of creationists to suspect that these are not human. So there have been a bunch of different ideas about what these might be. Some people say they're clearly human, and humans are just more diverse than we thought. There you go. They're descendants of Adam and Eve. They're just more diverse than we thought. Others have said they're absolutely not human. They're animals that somehow washed into the cave, which is really hard to understand how that works. And others have said that they are a mix of human and animal fossils. So the ideas run the gamut of explanation of what these things are. And what it reminds me of, it's very easy for me to sort of say, this is the answer, and I have the answer, and you should subscribe to my newsletter, and I will tell you all about it. But what it tells me is I'm so very much reminded of those 19th century anthropologists, people who think they understand the data and think they know how to interpret it. Their cultural bias tells them how to interpret things, and they have data that back it up, and so they must have the right answer, right? And I look at what we knew about hominins when I was a kid, and now, 40 years later, what we know about hominins, and I see this huge blossoming of knowledge that makes me very reticent to make real strong arguments about much of anything anymore. I do feel pretty strongly that Homo naledi is human. I feel less strongly that all the Demonese skulls are human, but I'm okay with uncertainty, and I'm okay with being convinced otherwise. Although with naledi, I think the burial stuff really sort of clinches it for me. It's really hard for me to imagine how animals would do that, why animals would bother, and if you think it's a pet cemetery, why in the world would you... It's a long way down there. It's hours of crawling through dark passages, and I find it hard to believe you do that for grandma, but doing that for Fido, I just don't buy it at all. So it's tough for me to understand the context of Homo naledi. Anyway, so some final thoughts here. I haven't given you any answers because I've just sort of reached that stage in my career where I'm far more interested in the questions than I am in the answers, because questions lead me to discover new things, and that's pretty exciting. So one thing, these thoughts sort of influence how you will interpret any of this stuff. One big thing is the chronology and how old you think the hominin fossils are. Christians who think the earth is old and that's compatible with the Bible, they've got a challenge because, well, Neanderthals are clearly found in fossil layers well before Homo sapiens, and I have Neanderthals in my family tree. I had myself tested. Sure enough, I've got Neanderthal DNA in me, just like every other European and Asian person on the planet. We all have Neanderthal genes in us. So you're pushing Adam and Eve back on the conventional dating scheme to well earlier than 500,000 years. So if you want to keep Adam and Eve and make them the ancestors of everybody, you've got to push them way back, and maybe even earlier. On the other hand, if you're a young age creationist, well, you're going to have to explain all that radiometric dating and all the other geological context of all these fossils, and I don't mean to imply that that's much easier. That's also challenging. What was the flood? As you might imagine, Winchell, our racist anthropologist from the 19th century who believed multiple families of humans, only one of which was Adam and Eve, he didn't believe in a flood. He didn't believe that the flood covered the entire earth. He didn't believe in Noah's Ark. He just thought it was sort of a local thing that happened, and maybe Noah had some livestock on the ark, on the boat with him. But he didn't believe that this was a big thing that destroyed all the people. If you do believe that that's the case, then you're going to have a very different understanding of these fossils. And are they pre-flood? Are they post-flood? How do you fit them into that context? Because what you think they are is going to be influenced by that as well. And of course, what does it mean to be human? And how do you recognize humanity in a fossil? And when I ask that question, I look at this guy. So this guy sits on a shelf right above my desk so I can see him regularly and ponder the mysteries of Dmanisi, because he's so different. He is so different. And I look into his empty eye sockets and wish that I could know who this was so I could understand what he's all about. And I pray for more discoveries, because maybe newer discoveries will help us understand. If we could have more of this guy with maybe some stone implements, stone tools or something, that would help figuring out what this might be. But he is really different. And so it's easy, I think, for modern creationists to look at things and say, that's definitely human, that's definitely not human. It's much harder to explain why you think that, and why the way you distinguish these things is the way you ought to distinguish these things. Why are those characters that you pick out the right ones and not just cherry picking? And I also wonder about the next big discovery. I already know there's one on its way. It is a creature that I'm pretty sure is an animal. It's called Littlefoot, Australopithecus prometheus. The cleaned skeleton was debuted just recently, so scientific descriptions of the skeleton should be published within the next year. And it is the single most complete single skeleton of a hominin known. So I'm really eager to see what that looks like. I already know it's got a opposable big toe, so its foot is more like a hand, and it's got other features that lead me to suspect that it is not a human being. Although, don't want to jump the gun, you never know. I could always make myself even more unpopular with other creationists by saying that Littlefoot is human, but I hope not. So thinking through this, I'm not giving you a lot of answers tonight because I've just been pondering all these questions lately. And I think the questions to me are becoming more important. It is, I think, our quest to have answers right now that leads to all the feuding. There's so much feuding in the creation evolution world. I've been thinking about that a lot lately, and I'm really becoming more interested in why individuals have the ideas that they do and believe what they do, and far less interested in trying to convince them with my interpretation of everything. So I'm happy to give my interpretation when I publish my technical papers, but at the same time, I know that lots of people have other ideas and other opinions, and I think it's okay, and it's actually important for us to make sure that we're doing the science well and analyzing data well and thinking through things well. But I also know that there are other values, other important issues, and I don't ever want to become complacent and lazy in my thinking, so I really kind of need the challenge to think more deeply and more carefully about what I'm doing. And so I think it's important for us to sort of listen to one another and not just sort of knee-jerk react to someone who says Neanderthals are not human, or someone who says that Dmanisi is not human, or that Homo naledi is not human, even though I find that impossibly unlikely. So that's it. I am happy to take questions, and this is normally the time where I advertise the next presentation. But there won't be one, and I haven't scheduled one for, I haven't made up schedule yet, so I'll let you know when I have that done. But thank you for coming. If you got questions, if you want me to spell things out for you a little more explicitly, I'd be happy to do so. Hey, thanks for watching my video lecture. If you liked that, do me a favor and hit the subscribe button. If you didn't like it, do me a favor and post your outrage on social media so that other people will see it and maybe they'll hit the subscribe button. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter. You can find our website, Core Academy, is at coursesci.org. My own blog is toddcwood.blogspot.com. Thanks for watching.